Now that you're not a beginner anymore, we need to talk about variable scope a little bit further, and specifically talk about global and static variables and what those can mean for us and do for us. We saw global briefly in the essential training, but I want to go into it again here and expand on it a bit to make sure that you understand what's going on. So I'm going to open up that basic.html again and just do another save as on it. And we'll call this one variable scope.php. Variable scope. Okay, we talked about local and global variables in the previous training. Just to refresh your memory, variables that are declared inside the PHP document are in the global scope. So if I just start declaring something like var equals 1, that is in the global scope. Variables declared inside a function have a local scope. So if I say, for example, function test1, and we'll go ahead and just declare a variable inside there, var equals 2, and that has a local scope. It's local to that function. And we can test this out by just having it echo out those two values for us. So var, and let's have it do br for us. And we'll take the same line and we'll just put it down here, but we'll also need to, of course, call the function test1. So if we try that out in a browser, and let's go to variable scope. Oops. It figured out the PHP for me. .php. There it goes. Now you notice that the first time the value is 2, and the second time it's 1. So even though we set the variable to 1, then we defined our function, which doesn't actually do anything, right? Doesn't execute anything. Then we execute the function here, which does set variable equal to 2, and we echo it out. That's the first 2 we're seeing. But then when it comes back and echoes it again, it is echoing the variable that's in the global scope. So study that a little bit and make sure you understand the difference between local and global. Now we saw, though, in the essential training that we could also do it another way so that we could have access to that global value inside our local function. We'll just take this same thing again, and we'll come down here. Of course, I'll need to make it test2 so that we don't conflict with the previously defined function. But this time, the one difference I'm going to do is I'm going to call global and var. So what that does is it says, hey, you know that var in the global scope? That's what I mean when I talk about var. All references from var from here on out, I'm talking about that thing. It's like importing it into the local scope, but it retains it. So it just pulls it in so that we can work with it as a reference almost. So let's try that. Let's go back and let's load up our page again. Now you'll notice that var did change the second time. So this assignment here, var2, did take place to only the global scope. It brought in the global to the local, made the assignment, and that assignment stuck around. So again, study those two examples and make sure you understand what global is and why we use that global declaration before our variable to let it know that we want to use the global value. Now, the main reason I wanted to go over this and make sure that you understand it is not just so that you're comfortable in using it, but also because it leads us into talking about static variables. A static variable is a local variable to a function, but with one important difference. It doesn't lose its value when the function is done. So look back at test1. Typically, calling test1 will always yield the same value, 2. If we increment it, it's always going to revert back. To show you what I mean, I'm going to copy this whole thing again. And this time, I'll make it test3. There we go. And then I'll take out the global line for now. And once this whole thing is done, then let's do var plus plus, right? So that's just going to increment var. That's a shorthand to say var equals var plus 1. So it's going to increment it one time. Now let's try running this one and see what happens. So I'm going to run it, and it's 2 and 1, right? Just like it was before. Let's try running it a second time and a third time here. So I'm going to call it 3 times. Every time it's equal to 2, right? This incrementation that we did, it increments, right? So var is set to 2, it outputs 2, and then var is set to 3. And the next time we call it, var is equal to 2, var outputs, var gets incremented, it gets set to 3. But if we declare static in front of it, static var with a default value of 2, then when we call it every time, it increments 2, 3, 4. So notice it's still a local value, right? It didn't affect 1. That's on our global scope. It's still in the local scope, but it's a static value now that keeps its value and sticks around every time the function is called. So it works like a counter variable inside this function. Now, while we won't use static variables very often, it's a good tool to know about. But even more importantly, I want you to understand that so that you won't be confused when we talk about a slightly different application of the word static when we get to object-oriented programming a little later. There's going to be another use of the word static, and this is going to be helpful to have this as a foundation so that we can talk about that. A lot of beginning programmers get the two confused and aren't sure what the difference between them is, but that won't happen for us.